Before Girolamo Savonarola shook the city of Florence, almost nobody wanted to hear him preach. We remember him now as the fiery Dominican preacher who challenged corruption, confronted the powerful, stirred Florence, and eventually paid with his life. But before all of that, before the crowds, before the controversy, before the authorities knew what to do with him, there was a season when he preached and almost nobody cared. That is the part of the story I cannot get away from. At one point in Florence, the crowd was said to be fewer than 25 people. 25. Not 2,500, not a packed cathedral, not a city trembling under conviction. 25 people. And here's why that matters. Savonarola was not a teenager experimenting with some vague dream. He was about 30 years old. He had already entered the Dominican order. He had studied. He had been formed. He was pretty serious, and he had a message. He had a burden. And yet, when he opened his mouth, almost nothing happened. That may be one of the most important parts of the whole story. Because sometimes the thing you're eventually called to do is the very thing that first seems to produce no fruit at all. Savonarola was born in 1452. Even as a young man, he was deeply troubled by the corruption he saw around him, especially corruption in the church. That is one of the earliest clues in his life. His calling did not appear as a platform. It appeared as an ache. He was bothered by something other people had learned to tolerate, and that's worth noticing. Sometimes your calling first shows up as a thing you cannot make peace with. Not every frustration is a calling, of course, but sometimes a deep burden keeps returning. It disturbs you. It follows you. It becomes impossible to ignore. For Savonarola, that burden was spiritual corruption, moral compromise, and the need for repentance and reform. In 1475, when he was about 22 years old, he entered the Dominican order. He essentially ran away from home and left a note on the kitchen table. The Dominicans were known as the Order of Preachers. This was not merely some kind of a retreat from the world so that you don't have to deal with problems. It was actually a life of study, discipline, prayer, and preaching. By 1482, when he was about 29 or 30, Savonarola was assigned to the Dominican convent of San Marco in Florence. And we need to pause there for a minute because the word convent can throw us off. In modern days, we tend to think of a convent as an all-women's religious house. But historically, the word simply meant a religious community where people gathered together. At San Marco, Savonarola taught novices. Now, novices are people who are brand new to living in a religious order. They've not taken any vows yet. Think of this as jobs you may have had where the first 90 days you're on like this probationary period. In this phase, the novices are trying to figure out, is this life really for me? And the friars are also trying to determine, is this person really suited to our way of life? Savonarola helped form younger men entering the order. He taught, studied, prepared sermons, and continued to carry this deep burden for reform. And then he began to preach. But at first, it didn't work. He preached in places like Florence, and the results were painfully unimpressive. His early teaching did not move the city. It did not create this massive awakening. It didn't fill the church. In fact, in one early preaching series, I believe this was a Lenten series, the crowd had dwindled to fewer than 25 people. Again, he was around 30 years old enough to know this hurt, young enough to wonder if maybe he had missed his calling. That is the first major lesson in this story. Calling does not always produce early effectiveness. We often assume that if God calls someone, well, the doors are just going to open quickly and the crowds are going to gather and there's going to be this immediate sign of success and the gift is going to be obvious. But Savonarola's story does not work that way. He had the burden, he had the seriousness, He had the message, but the audience was not ready, or the need was not ready, or the moment was not ready. Maybe all three. So what did he do? Well, he stepped back from preaching. He returned to teaching novices. And this is where we have to be careful. In our modern success-based thinking, we might look at this as failure. He tried preaching, it didn't work. So he went back to a smaller assignment, but maybe that smaller assignment was not a demotion. Maybe it was hidden formation. He was still teaching, still praying, still studying, still being shaped, still forming others while God was forming him. That is the second major theme. When a public door closes, the hidden assignment may still be sacred. There are seasons when the thing you wanted to do publicly does not seem to work, and God sends you back into a quieter room, a smaller room, a less impressive room, a room with no applause. But that does not mean nothing is happening. In Savonarola's case, something was happening. First, a bit of background as we move into this next story. Churches have governing bodies. Now, you've probably heard about some of these if you've ever been around a mainline denomination. The Presbyterian Church has the Presbytery. Lutheran Church has various synods. In Savonarola's time, he was asked to attend a large meeting called a chapter general. And this was being held in a town called Reggio Emilia. There was a moment during this convention when he contributed to a large discussion on discipline. As the story is often told, his answer was so powerful that it stirred not only the people who were there, but it stirred Savonarola himself. That is fascinating. Sometimes you discover the fire in you when you are forced to answer. You may not fully understand what you carry until the moment you're called on to deliver it. You may not know the force of your own conviction until the moment requires you to speak. For Savonarola, something awakened. When he returned to Florence, he found it almost impossible to remain silent. He began preaching again, including at the little church connected with a Murate convent. But here's where the story gets even more human. At the same time, another preacher, Brother Mariano, was drawing immense crowds at a large church in town called the Santo Spirito. And his message was apparently easier, more pleasing, less severe. The other man had the crowd. Savonarola had the burden. And that contrast infuriated him. Honestly, that may be one of the most relatable parts of the whole story. Because if you've ever carried a serious message, you know about the pain of watching easier messages draw larger crowds or more attention. Someone else says the smooth thing and they've got people coming to them like crazy. You say the hard thing and people just vanish. Someone else entertains and the room fills up. You warn, you teach, you labor, you tell the truth, and 25 people show up. That comparison can absolutely poison a calling. But Savonarola did not simply soften his message to win the room. Instead, he pressed deeper into prayer and meditation. He waited on God. He wrestled with the burden. And then, according to the story, something breaks through. Savonarola received what he understood to be a vision from God. He saw with new force and clarity the judgment of God, the corruption of the church, the coming need for purification and reform. The burden that had been simmering in him since his youth now became something far more commanding. It was no longer just frustration. It was commission. From that point forward, he seemed to carry a new sense of purpose and spiritual authority. He was not just angry that easier messages were drawing bigger crowds. He'd become convinced that God had given him a message he could not abandon, even if it cost him the crowd, the approval of the powerful, or eventually his life. That does not mean he handled everything perfectly. Savonarola was not a safe, sanitized, inspirational figure. He was intense. He was severe, combustible. History does not give us a cardboard saint. It gives us a complicated guy. But the pattern still matters. That burden did not leave him. The failure did not end him. And the comparison did not direct him to an easier message. The hidden years formed him, and the vision gave his burden a sharper edge. Then came the shift. In 1485 and 1486, when he was somewhere in the 32 to 34 years old, Savonarola preached in San Gimignano. There, the themes that later defined him became clear: repentance, judgment, renewal, and the warning that the church would be scourged and reformed. He was not yet the dominant voice of Florence, but the message was sharpening. In 1490, when he was about 37 years old, Savonarola returned to Florence. This time, things were different. The man was different. The moment was different. The city was different. His lectures began drawing attention. Now remember, he's directing the novices here. Laymen, ordinary people outside the monastery, were begging to be admitted to hear him teach his classes to the novices. The crowds for his lectures grew so large that they had to move from the lecture setting into the church itself. Think about that. Earlier, fewer than 25 people were listening. Now the crowds were growing so large, he needed a bigger space. Now there's a 6 to 8 year gap between this failure and this fruit. Now, that's not an instant breakthrough. That is not overnight success. That is not post 3 times and go viral. That is a burden. That is failure. That is formation. It's waiting. It's sharpening and return. And then by 1494, when he was about 42, his influence in Florence had become enormous. He was no longer some disregarded preacher. He had become a public force. But here's where the story refuses to become a clean success story. His influence did not make him safe. It made him dangerous. As his fame grew, so did the opposition. He confronted corruption. He challenged power. He drew the attention of political authorities and church authorities, including Pope Alexander VI. He was threatened and restricted. Eventually, in 1497, he was excommunicated. The next year, at age 45, he was arrested, condemned, and executed in Florence. So, what do we do with a story like this? Because it would be easy to turn Savonarola into a very simplistic lesson. Oh, if you just keep pressing in, eventually you'll succeed. But that's not quite true. Yes, he eventually gained influence. Florence listened. Yes, his preaching eventually shook the city. But the story did not end with comfort, applause, and a big retirement package. It ended with fire. So the lesson can't be, if you're faithful, everything works out the way you had hoped. The lesson's deeper than that. Savonarola's life shows us that a calling may begin as a burden, pass through a phase of humiliating ineffectiveness, mature in an area of hidden discipline, erupt in public power, and still cost the messenger everything. And maybe that's why his story still matters. Because many people assume that if God called them into something, the path is just going to become obvious. Because sometimes it becomes more confusing. You feel the ache early, but nobody listens. You try the thing you're called to do, and it fails. You watch somebody else with an easier message gain the crowd. You go back to a hidden room, you pray, study, wrestle, wonder whether you're wrong, you misheard God, timing's off. But then over time, something in you changes. The message deepens. The motives are tested. The gift is sharpened. The timing shifts. And maybe, eventually, the door opens again. But even then, influence is not always a reward. Sometimes influence is an exposure. It exposes your message. It exposes your motives. Exposes you to opposition. That's why calling must be about faithfulness before it's about outcome. Savonarola's story gives us 4 major lessons. First, the burden often comes before the platform. Before anyone listened, he was already troubled by corruption. The ache came first. Second, failure may come in the very area of your calling. The fact that people did not listen at first did not mean he had nothing to say. Third, hidden formation matters. Teaching novices may have looked smaller than his calling of preaching to crowds, but it was part of the making of the man. And fourth, calling has a cost. When the message finally landed, it did not make him comfortable. It made him consequential. So if you're in a season where the thing you thought God called you to do seems ignored, do not rush to the conclusion that you've missed it or that your timing's off. Maybe you did. It's possible. Discernment matters. But maybe something else is happening. Maybe the burden is real, but the timing is not yet full. Maybe the message is real, but it's still being purified. Maybe the gift is real, but it's still being trained. Maybe the small room is not punishment. Maybe it's preparation. Before Savonarola shook Florence, almost nobody wanted to hear him preach. And maybe that's the part of the story we most need to remember. Because sometimes the hidden chapter is not the end of the calling. Sometimes it's where the fire is being formed. Thanks, everyone. My name is Jason Owens, and you've been listening to the Deepwater Labs podcast. We're in a series talking about the book, Deeper Experiences of Famous Christians. Check out the show notes for a link. As always, I'd greatly appreciate hearing your thoughts on today's episode. Just reach out to me at jason@deepwaterlabs.com. Thanks, everyone.